Okay.
Okay.
A ver, how we shall organize?
Okay. First, I think at first is going to be Professor Toporowski, and after that, you go, Professor Noemí.
Pero no vas a hacer una introducción.
Yeah. First of all, I'm going to introduce you, Professor Jorge Villegas, that is the chief of the Department of Economics in Acatlán, and he is going to open the session. Okay.
Okay.
Then after that, you go, Professor Toporowski, and how much time do you need for your presentation?
I can do it in about 45 minutes.
Okay. We are okay. Then, Moni, ustedes me dicen cuando quieran iniciar.
Danos unos minutos, te haremos una señal y entonces para que empieces, ¿vale?
Ok, perfecto.
Unos minutos.
Entonces,
2 minutes.
entro, saludo a todos, le doy la palabra al profesor Villegas y después ya vuelvo a moderar y empezamos con el doctor Toporowski, ¿les parece? Muy bien.
Okay.
Yeah, can I just have, for the sake of organization, because it's getting late, it's getting towards the evening here in London.
Yeah.
Can I have some idea how long, what the format will be? So we do presentations and then there's discussion. What time do you expect how long do you expect the seminar to last?
Maybe 1 hour and a half.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. That's fine.
We have to wait. You see, the room is almost full.
Okay. We've got 18. Okay. Wow.
No, the room it's hybrid. It's in presence and
Yeah.
You
can see the room full of people.
And there
my goodness.
also students.
Uh-huh. Okay.
I can hear you. Your mic.
¿A mí me decías?
Sí.
Es que lo apagué.
Okay.
Estoy en la Sorry, I'm in the university, so if I'm not speaking, I will shut the microphone because too many people are around here.
I think also if you have too many people with an open microphone, then to become funny, and the connection is bridge. I will actually switch. I will mute myself. I'll switch my sound off until until my moment comes.
Okay.
Jorge, ya empezamos,
Mándeme.
¿no?
¿Ya
empezamos?
Nos van a dar una señal. Ellos nos van a dar una señal
Ah.
para empezar. Déjeme, voy a marcarle para que me diga cuándo. Professor Toporowski, we must wait for a little bit more. A couple of minutes.
Listo.
That's okay.
Okay.
It gives me more time to.
Okay. Right now, I'm going to start. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. As you know, we have two important guests, Professor Jan Toporowski of SOAS University of London, and Noemí Levy, professor of the Faculty of Economics. It's a pleasure for me to introduce them to you in this moment. And we need to start with the presentation of this session. This session is going to be divided in two parts. First of all, we have the presentation of Jan Toporowski, and after that, we're going to have the presentation of Professor Noemí Levy. Thank you, everyone, in this room, in this virtual room, and in the session live in Acatlán. And let me say that this session is in the context of the 23 edition of the Economics Week. And without hesitation, I'm going to give you the word to Professor Jorge Villegas, who is the chief of the economics department at FES Acatlán. Please, Professor Villegas, you have the mic. Profesor Villegas, tiene el micrófono para la presentación. Bonnie, ¿se me escuchas? Sí.
Hacemos tu presentación. Muy buenos días. La Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, la FES Acatlán, la División de Ciencias Socioeconómicas y el Programa de Economía les da la más cordial bienvenida. El día de hoy tenemos la presentación y la conferencia magistral del doctor Toporowski, y nos acompaña para esta ocasión la doctora Noemí Levy y el doctor Jorge Bustamante. Les agradecemos la presencia de ustedes, sobre todo el interés que han mostrado por esta importancia de la economía, no solo a nivel nacional, sino a nivel internacional. Sabemos que el conocimiento es global y que cada día y día con día las consecuencias económicas de las decisiones que toman los gobernantes se fundamentan en esquemas teóricos que están día a día cambiantes. Por eso nuestra semana es el cambio del pensamiento económico a nivel internacional. ¿Qué está pasando en la economía mundial en estos principios de siglo? Les damos la más cordial bienvenida, agradecemos al doctor Toporowski su valioso apoyo, tiempo, y a ustedes les damos las gracias. Bienvenido, doctor Jorge Bustamante, si es tan amable en iniciar la plática. Muchas gracias, bienvenidos, un placer saludarlos.
Gracias, profesor Villegas, por la introducción. Thank you, everyone. I don't know if you can see my presentation. I'm going to introduce you I'm going to read the bio of Professor Jan Toporowski. Professor Jan Toporowski is professor of economics and finance at the School of Oriental African Studies, University of London. Visiting professor of economics at the University of Bergamo, professor of economics at finance at the International University College Turin. He has published widely on monetary theory and policy, finance, and microeconomics. He worked in a fund management, international banking, and central banking. He has been a consultant for the United Nations Development Program, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and the Economic Commission for Africa and the Economics Intelligence Unit. Please, Professor Toporowski, it's a pleasure for us to have you here. I think it's gonna be your first time in Acatlán. For that, it's a pleasure to. I don't know. I'm asking. I'm asking you. Now I'm going to give you the floor, Professor Toporowski. You can start when you want. Let me okay. Okay. I have problems with my presentation. I'm gonna Moni, no se me puede quitar la presentación.
There we are.
Listo. You are ready to start.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that a warm and generous introduction. What I would like to do now is, if I can, find a way of getting my screen. Yes, here it is. My PowerPoint. Here we are. My slides. What I'll talk about today is the developing countries in the international monetary market, or the international money market, markets as they're known. And I'll say a few words about the future of international money, because I think this is we're going through some unprecedented changes in the international monetary system, and it's not like, as the textbooks say, that as you get more and more free trade, it all improves. It doesn't. It has always been a highly political matter. What I will do is I will analyze the place of developing countries in the international money markets or in the international monetary system, based on Kalecki's critique of Bretton Woods. And this was a critique that highlighted in particular the capital and monetary needs of the developing countries. Kalecki's critique has been made even more relevant by the growth of private sector foreign borrowing in developing countries. By this I mean the borrowing in foreign currencies by the private sectors in developing countries. This has important monetary functions, not just for the private sectors of developing countries and emerging markets, but it also has very important functions for governments of developing countries, and for in particular the balance between the foreign borrowing and the domestic borrowing of governments in developing countries. And I will, towards the end of my presentation, mention some of the present difficulties in the international monetary system, which I believe have behind them some fundamental problems of the capital markets, rather than just the issues of short-term bank credit that appears in, for example, the International Monetary Fund data, or as international money. Short-term bank credit is international money, but it is also linked to the difficulties of the capital markets, and I hope to show you more of this. I will refer in my talk to a particularly important book around Kalecki's critique of Bretton Woods, a book edited by myself and Jerzy Osiatyński. It's called International Equilibrium and Bretton Woods, Kalecki's Alternative to Keynes and White and Its Consequences. And although most of the book is about Bretton Woods, it actually brings the discussion much more up to date in its examining of how Kalecki identified the fundamental flaws in the international monetary system. The contributions from the book, there are contributions in the book from Jerzy Osiatyński. If some of you may know of, may have heard of Kalecki's work, it is likely that you heard about his work from the work of Jerzy Osiatyński, who is the editor of Kalecki's collected works and published quite a large amount of Kalecki's work. Another contributor who Jerzy Osiatyński sadly died last year. Another contributor, sadly also not with us, is Julio Lopez Gallardo. Julio Lopez was originally Chilean. He studied with Kalecki and he ended his life in the last I think 40 years of his life was spent 30 or 40 years of his life was spent in Mexico, where he taught at UNAM. And there is a chapter in the book written, co-authored by Anna Szymborska. My co-speaker today, Professor Noemí Levy has also contributed a chapter, and some of the ideas in that chapter will be in her presentation. There are also contributions by a distinguished historian, Peter Clark, two distinguished Latin American economists, Esteban Pérez Caldente and Matías Fernengo. They contribute a chapter on Raúl Prebisch and his critique of Bretton Woods. And finally, yet another Latin American, although she has an English name, Stephanie Griffith-Jones, who is currently on the Monetary Policy Committee of the Chilean Central Bank. So let me say what were the problems of Bretton Woods that Kalecki identified, and he identified these as being the problems that stemmed from the monetary plans of Keynes and White. The Keynes plan was the plan that Keynes put forward on behalf of the British government. Harry Dexter White was the financial advisor to the US Treasury, and he put forward the American point of view. Kalecki argued that they had an incorrect view of equilibrium in the international monetary markets. They considered equilibrium as being defined as the balance of as the foreign trade balance. In other words, the balance in trade with goods and services, and of course this ignores the capital balance, which is very, very important, and in particular for developing countries, where it is the source of much of the instability, monetary and financial instability of developing countries. The Kalecki questioned the compatibility of balanced foreign trade with full employment, and this applied both to developing countries, but also the industrialized countries, as if governments try to achieve full employment by means of demand management by fiscal policy, then it's very easy for them to come to a condition where they import more, they import too much relative to their exports. So this then becomes a problem in the case of countries whose governments try to achieve full employment. This is so balanced foreign trade may not be compatible with full employment, and it was certainly the case for many countries in Europe and elsewhere after Bretton Woods. Kalecki argued that there was the plans that were put forward lacked instruments to secure balanced trade. Much of this is concerned with exchange rate inelasticity. Kalecki certainly believed that if you depreciate if you devalue the currency in order to make your exports more competitive, this actually may not improve the employment situation, because you may expand employment in the investment goods sector, but you may at the same time squeeze the domestic market, because devaluation means that imports cost more, and this devalues the incomes generated within the economy because of higher import prices. And in particular, Kalecki pointed out that for developing countries, there is a major need for excess imports of capital goods. In other words, a capital account deficit is needed, and this may not necessarily be matched by a surplus in the current account. And in countries where there is a surplus in the current account, they're very often countries where there is, for example, in the Middle East, which are countries which are lightly populated. They don't have a large labor force, so industrialization doesn't arise. But there is a problem that if a country is going to industrialize, it needs to import capital goods. Kalecki's solution was a systematic.
Professor, your mic is off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, you can hear me now.
Yeah. It's okay.
Was a system of systematic provision of long-term credits for industrialization from an international investment board to keep the money markets, the international money markets, in equilibrium, so that as countries industrialized, they were given international credits which would allow them to import the equipment necessary for industrialization. However, this then gives rise to a political problem of who determines the industrialization strategy. Is it the developing country government or governments or the governments controlling the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank? This was something which both Kalecki and Oskar Lange, another Polish economist, also put forward, essentially because if the international funds are controlled by the people who put in the funds, then it means that in effect they control the industrialization strategy of the developing countries. And it's interesting that since the 1990s, since the turn of the century, we now have the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank now pay much more attention to the opinion of the G20. The G20 was established specifically to give a voice to the developing countries in the policies of the IMF and the World Bank. Quite how much voice they have, one can be a little bit skeptical, but they do have some voice. And this critique of Kalecki and Lange actually echoes a critique that was put forward independently by Raoul Prebisch. Prebisch, at the time of Bretton Woods, was actually in Mexico. Prebisch had fallen out with the Argentine President Perón, and had Prebisch had been the managing director of the Central Bank of Argentina. He resigned after Perón came to power and moved to Mexico, and he then wrote some very important articles criticizing the Keynes and the White plans, but really from a political angle, his his monetary theory was, I think, less sophisticated than that of Kalecki. Okay, where is my? Oops. This seems okay. What's happened since Kalecki's solution? Yeah, okay. No, Kalecki's solution was Kalecki was talking as an outsider. Neither he nor Langer nor Prebisch had any influence on what was actually agreed. Keynes and White eventually compromised on the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, with an international monetary system linked to gold. And Noemí, Levy will say more of this. However, they hailed the Bretton Woods Agreement as a great achievement, because with free capital movements, although actually it didn't inaugurate a world of free capital movements. There was an international payment system, but this payment system was mediated by central banks, and moreover did not prevent the accumulation of foreign currency balances in the private sector. And that in turn gave rise to, from the 1960s onwards, to the euro markets, or the accumulation of deposits in offshore financial centers. And this eventually gave rise to the loss of central bank control over exchange rates and capital movements. In the emerging markets, what happened was that governments in the 1970s and but in particular from the 1980s onwards, were encouraged, in some cases forced, to adopt much less restrictive policies in terms of their capital account, in terms of regulating capital flows. And one of the consequences of this was the emergence of new developing country multinationals. And this is an interesting development from the 1990s onwards. You have these new multinationals. I guess the most famous Mexican ones are Cemex and Telmex, but there are India has produced some important ones. The ArcelorMittal, the steel firm, Tata, which is a motor car company. China has Huawei. What they did was they didn't use the financial resources of the developing countries, or the countries from which they came, but they simply set up a company in, usually a small one, started off small in a financial center, in a global financial center, New York, Miami, London, Amsterdam, where they borrowed money in order to buy companies in the developing in the industrialized economies. This was it was a strategy in which it was important because it was a hedged strategy. It was hedged by matching the currencies of the assets and the liabilities, and one that fed into US dollar hegemony. In effect, it was corporations from developing countries recognizing that they had to work with US dollar hegemony, and if they were going to have liabilities, if they're going to borrow in US dollars, then the sensible thing is to hedge this borrowing with dollar assets. And needless to say, this plays a very little developmental role for a developing country. The US dollar hegemony has been reinforced, certainly since the 1990s, by a system of international currency swaps, whereby the US Federal Reserve offers to swap dollars for other currencies from a restricted range of countries. It's the range is restricted. The most important one is the European Central Bank, but there are also the Bank of Japan, the major European central banks outside the European Monetary Union, so the Bank of Sweden, the Bank of England. Among developing and emerging markets, then there is the South Korean central bank, the central, and in Latin America, the central banks of Mexico and Brazil. So these are swap agreements. They're agreements under which the central banks in those countries can borrow dollars directly from the US Federal Reserve, and this borrowing is hedged by an agreement that they will swap those dollars back, that they will swap back the Mexican pesos or the Brazilian real for the dollars. They'll swap them back after a certain period. So this is it's a standard procedure, but it's supposed to be very, very secure. And actually, because of the obligation to swap back, it hasn't actually been used very much. Nevertheless, it's tended to stabilize. The possibility of being able to borrow at short notice has tended to stabilize exchange rates. And nevertheless, the international monetary system has been unstable, and particularly in recent months. Some of this arises from the fragmented banking system in the United States. The US Federal Reserve, as some of you, well, as you'll probably be aware, is divided up into different districts or regions, and they this is because most American banks are actually quite small. They're only we hear about the big ones like JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, but most of the these are usually New York based, but in the rest of the country, most of the banks are fairly small, and they hold American government bonds as reserves. And herein lies a fundamental problem, because there have been for 14 years, since soon after the 2008 financial crisis. It's been 14 years of near zero policy rates of interest, which only in last year started to be reversed with higher rates of interest. This policy of near zero rates of interest has been even longer in Japan. I mean, it really goes back well over 2 decades. And there is what this has done is encouraged corporate bond issues in the rich countries and foreign borrowing in the developing countries. Why? Because it meant that a lot of the investment funds in developed, in industrialized countries were desperate to find bonds which would offer a non-zero rate of return, and there were always governments from the developing countries that were willing to offer these near zero policy rates of interest. There's been, however, the problem really arises because central banks for the last nearly 30 years have held to a doctrine of inflation targeting, which requires central banks to raise interest rates in order to control inflation. In practice, central banks can do very little to control inflation, but as they've been raising interest rates, look what happens. Higher interest rates mean lower bond prices. What do lower bond prices mean? Well, it means that all the bonds that were being held by smaller banks as security, as reserves, now have less value, have lost value, and this is what gave rise to the problem of this, for example, the Silicon Valley Bank. This process of raising interest rates, or is sometimes referred to as the normalization of the yield curve. So what I show here is the what's happened to the US 10-year government bond rate, and you can see that the where a year ago this rate was well below, or substantially below 2.5%. By November 2022, it had gone up to well over 4%, and it's since wiggled about a little bit, but dropped to 3.5%, but it's still substantially above the rate previously. So there are two fundamental problems that I think are faced in the international monetary system. First of all, inflation targeting requires higher interest rates, and with the consequences for the bond markets that we've already seen. Now, up until now, how did central banks secure lower interest rates? Well, they secured lower interest rates simply by buying bonds. They've now said that they're no longer going to buy bonds. So all the banks that thought that their bond holdings were secure and that there would always be a central bank buyer if they ever wanted to sell them, can no longer sell those, can no longer be so sure that they can sell those bonds at a good price. In fact, they can only sell them for a lower price. And this added to the fact that capital markets have been weak, structurally weak, since the 1990s. Now, why have they been structurally weak? They've been structurally weak because insurance companies and pension funds have not been buying long-term corporate securities. They've not been buying long-term corporate securities because they cannot get a good return from them. They've preferred to put their money into more speculative activities, buying bonds, or investing in private equity, hedge funds, and buying bonds of some emerging market governments. This structurally weak capital market means that has had effects for corporations and businesses, in that it has been difficult for corporations to issue long-term securities, shares, or stock, to regulate their liquidity. Let's remember, in Keynes and in Kaletsky, they both pointed out that when corporations issue long-term bonds or shares, they're not doing this for investment purposes, but they're doing this in order to regulate their own internal liquidity. And the flooding of the financial markets with money, which was a monetary solution to the structural weakness of the capital markets, it did not really resolve this structural weakness. The quantitative easing that has been undertaken since 2008 and since much earlier in Japan hasn't resolved this essential problem that pension funds and insurance companies don't want to buy long-term securities. So in developing countries, there is an increasing dependence on the foreign financing of governments and corporations. This has been particularly created by the near zero interest rates in the USA and Western Europe and Japan over the period of 2008 to 2022. They're now facing crises of refinancing of foreign borrowing. This is many of these governments issued 10-year bonds over the last 15-20 years, usually reissuing new 10-year bonds to repay the old bonds. This is called a process of rolling over debt, and they found that they cannot refinance this at the same low rates of interest. The current rates of interest for emerging market governments is much higher. The solution is really to return to domestically financed development programs. In other words, not bothering with the international monetary markets. The international money markets are sustained by the system of Federal Reserve currency swaps. However, there's been a rising use of the Chinese currency, the renminbi, as a reserve currency. There are also, according to the data, use of Japanese yen, Australian dollar, and even the Mexican peso. But this is really because of their role in foreign currency swaps, in other words, private sector swaps. There's a more fundamental problem with the role of China, the growing role of China, which is a kind of debt competition between China and the US and the IMF and the World Bank. The US, the IMF and the World Bank are increasingly reluctant to write off or roll over borrowing by governments in developing countries and emerging markets, because most of these governments also have borrowing from China, and the US, the IMF and the World Bank know very well that if they allow a government not to have to pay not have to service their debt towards the US, the IMF or the World Bank, then that money will be used to service Chinese debt, and in effect strengthening the Chinese financial system. So this phenomenon of debt competition is emerging as a particularly problematic area in the international financial system. I think I'll stop there now. We will let's go on to the next discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Toporowski, for your marvelous presentation. Now I'm gonna take a couple of minutes to introduce you, Professor Noemí Levy. Let me put my presentation. Do you see it?
Yeah.
Okay. Professor Noemí Levy is a full-time professor at Faculty of Economics, UNAM. She won the Research National University Award in 2014 and is member of the System of National Researchers Label 3. She has been coordinator of a variety of research projects about the effects of financialization in Latin America. She has published books and papers of national and international scope. Her research lines are financial sector, economic development, and underdevelopment of Latin America and heterodox thought. Please, Professor Noemí Levy, as you know, it's a pleasure for me that you are here with us. You have the floor for you.
A contracorriente voy a hablar en español. Recordando a Julio López, no quiero hablar en mojado, en inglés mojado. Entonces procedo a ello. Ya le di mi presentación al profesor Toporowski para que pueda seguir y podamos tener una discusión. Antes de empezar, quisiera agradecer a FES Acatlán de haber invitado y haber considerado este evento que es parte también de nuestro proyecto de investigación, y recordar que creo que mis inicios de mi tarea de investigación y difusión de las ideas empezó también en Acatlán, como hace 25 años, con la profesora Guadalupe Mantei, donde realizamos magnos eventos con la presencia del profesor Toporowski en esas oportunidades que nos íbamos para allá, y es una envidia ver ese salón tan lleno de vida, que esperamos podamos encontrarla nuevamente por todos lados. Gracias a los coordinadores, gracias a las autoridades de Acatlán. Voy a compartir mi pantalla. Sí se ve, ¿de verdad? Jorge, ¿sí se ve? Ok. Como dijo el profesor Toporowski, es parte del libro en que hoy día se están sacando buena parte de la idea, y creo que es bastante relevante en términos de lo que está sucediendo. Creo que el profesor Toporowski dio una excelente introducción a muchas de las ideas que voy a decir, entonces voy a acortar lo más posible para dejar que se eche a andar la discusión. ¿Qué está en riesgo? Yo sugeriría, dejen achicar esto, aquí, denme 2 segundos, ya achiqué. ¿Qué está en riesgo? El argumento central es que el sistema financiero dominante no es funcional ni para el crecimiento económico ni la estabilidad. Una expresión de ello es que la crisis financiera del 2008 no ha sido resuelta y reaparece en distintas formas. También en lo que ha dicho el profesor Toporowski, el exceso de liquidez generado por las políticas de relajación monetaria 1 y 2, aunque frenaron la bancarrota bancaria en general de las corporaciones y pararon los efectos inmediatos de la recesión económica, no generaron crecimiento.
Perdón.
Dime.
Perdón, me dicen que si puede ponerla en pantalla completa su presentación. Ahí en vista, doctora.
Ajá. Espérame.
Ajá.
A ver, espérame. Aquí, espérame. ¿Ya está? Ah, no.
Mira, aquí abajito, en donde está.
Ya, ahí está. Ah, ya sé dónde que me estás diciendo ya. Ay, ¿qué hice? Espérenme.
No pasa nada, doctor, no pasa nada.
Ay, espérenme. Yo que tan contenta estaba que ya lo había. Aquí estoy. A ver, ¿dónde está el vasito? Que no lo encuentro.
Arriba, en donde está en vista, fíjese ahí arriba. Dice revisar, grabar, vista. Píquele en vista. Vaya
No,
sobre
pues
esa,
ya
sobre
me
esa.
perdí.
Casi al final, casi al final. ¿Vista?
Aquí,
Ahí está, exacto. Píquele ahí.
Ya le piqué.
Y... ¿Dónde está la presentación? A ver, F5, doctora, del F5. Mire, ya apareció la de abajo, la cosita de abajo.
a ver dónde está la cosa de abajo.
Ahí,
porque
ahí, ahí, abajito, abajito, abajito.
¿Cuál es? A
El,
ver,
la cosita esta, si no es F5, me parece.
¿lo ves? Perdón, pero hay un problema generacional de...
Aquí abajito,
¿Ya?
ahí está.
El Zoom. Abajo, al lado del Zoom, mano derecha, por favor.
No, hasta abajo,
hasta
doctora,
abajo,
en la
casi al
parte de
final
abajo.
de la diapositiva. Ahí están, ya, ahí.
Ahí está.
Ok,
Sí,
ok,
Ya.
ahí está, listo.
perdón.
No.
Bueno,
Perdón.
exceso de liquidez frena bancarrota, pero no es una cosa sostenible, como decía el profesor Toporowski. Podemos también añadir que la configuración financiera dominante puede funcionar con inflación financiera. Pero es altamente sensible a aumentos en la tasa de interés. Aquí nada más doy dos datos. Cuando se regresó a la normalización monetaria en 2000, se anuncia en 2014 y se inicia en diciembre de 2015, ya en septiembre de 2018 tuvo una reversión de la tasa de interés de largo plazo. Y obviamente, como también el profesor Toporowski, la bancarrota, perdón, esta carrera dice en desarrollo, también lo mencionó, las tasas de interés pueden desencadenar crisis de deuda en las economías emergentes, que puede ser por deuda privada, que ese es un problema que vamos a ver, y interna o externa, que ese es el gran problema que podemos estar enfrentando. Entonces, nuevamente volvemos a esta historia de reestructurar el sistema financiero internacional y discutir sobre la permanencia del dólar como unidad de cuenta internacional. Nada más para algunas referencias, el viaje de Lula da Silva a China y su discurso en la toma de posición de Dilma en los BRICS. También me llamó mucho la atención las declaraciones del fondo que las sanciones de Estados Unidos y la Unión Europea a Rusia pueden debilitar el dólar estadounidense. Bueno, teniendo en cuenta estos elementos, vamos a analizar tres temas: la estructura del sistema financiero de Bretton Woods y sus fallas, la demonetización del oro y sus efectos en la nueva configuración del sistema financiero internacional y la deuda en América Latina. Me voy a ir relativamente rápido en esta parte de la historia, que es la estructura del sistema financiero de Bretton Woods y sus fallas, señalando que lo que se buscaba en la posguerra era crecimiento económico estable, evitar nuevos conflictos militares y limitar las actividades especulativas que generaron el desorden de la Primera Guerra. Como sabemos, hubieron tres propuestas, aunque dos solamente se discutieron, la de Keynes y White, que sabía que el profesor Toporowski iba a hablar de eso, entonces voy a decirla en dos palabras. Keynes propuso la Unión Internacional de Compensación, basada en Bancor, una unidad monetaria internacional organizada a partir de cuotas, calculada en función del comercio internacional de cada país. Esta unión operaría a través de sobregiros y emisión de crédito, y los intereses sobre la emisión de crédito deberían ser pagadas por países deficitarios y superavitarios, a fin de impedir esa carrera loca a tener un superávit en la cuenta corriente. Ello no prosperó porque eran tan bajas las tasas de interés que se imponían que era más fácil prestar por fuera de la Unión. White propuso un fondo de estabilización de las Naciones Unidas y asociados, basado en cuotas también, que se accede a las unidades de cuentas internacionales vía dinero nacional. Tengo derecho a tanta dinero internacional, entonces lo compro con mi moneda. Los desequilibrios de la cuenta corriente deberían de correr a cargo de los países deficitarios, es decir, el equilibrio debería realizarse nada más por ello. Ello implicaba incrementar su endeudamiento y seguir las famosas devaluaciones de ese periodo. El principal problema de la propuesta de White era la escasez de la moneda internacional. Voy a llegar en eso en un momento más. Schumacher y Kalecki, como muy bien lo reseñó el profesor Toporowski, hablan de acuerdos multilaterales basados en mecanismos compensatorios liderados por una unión internacional de compensación y un fondo nacional. No se necesitan monedas internacionales. Aquí todo se haría en monedas nacionales para enfrentar los superávit y déficit a través de... No me voy a detener mucho en esto porque eso también está explicado en el libro y lo abordó el profesor Toporowski. Y como él también dijo, se propuso un sistema de créditos a largo plazo para financiar el crecimiento económico, una cosa que supuestamente debió haber hecho el Banco de Desarrollo, pero que nunca se logró. Esta propuesta ni siquiera llegó a la reunión de Bretton Woods en Estados Unidos. Quien gana sabemos que es White, con el planteamiento de Estados Unidos, pero enfrentan su crisis muy rápido, en 47, porque no hay suficientes unidades de cuentas internacionales. El dólar estaba escaso. ¿Qué pasó después de esa crisis? El dólar sobrevive como unidad de cuenta internacional y para generar suficientes dólares, Estados Unidos tiene que entrar en déficit en sus cuentas corrientes y en la cuenta pública. Y ello proporciona liquidez al internacional. Aquí hay que señalar que el dólar estaba limitado en forma indirecta por el oro, es decir, nada más los bancos centrales podían hacer esta conversión. Los desequilibrios de las cuentas corrientes aumentaron en los países desarrollados y en desarrollo. De hecho, Estados Unidos fortaleció su posición hegemónica, recordemos toda la Guerra Fría, la Guerra de Vietnam, con este privilegio de emitir dinero o emitir deuda en el sistema financiero internacional. Podemos señalar que los desequilibrios, aquí me equivoqué, 71, no 76, los desequilibrios externos públicos combinados con la relación oro-dólar se volvieron inviables, y es así cuando en 1971, no en 76, fue desmonetizado el oro. ¿Qué pasó cuando nos encontramos que el dinero nacional e internacional es literalmente una deuda? La principal falla del sistema Bretton Woods fue que no desalentó el movimiento de capital privado. Este se mantuvo, como también lo preseñó el profesor Toporowski, en los famosos mercados euro-dólares. Esto inició muy poco después que las monedas europeas alcanzaran convertibilidad después de la guerra, que junto con los desequilibrios de las cuentas corrientes, activaron este mercado de valores no regular. Es así que en los 60 empieza a subir mucho el movimiento del mercado euro-dólar. A raíz del rompimiento oro-dólar, se cambia la forma, la estructura de los tipos de cambio, se vuelven flexibles y la tasa de interés empieza a moverse, se empieza a variar de periodo en periodo. Como dijimos, el dólar también sobrevive a esta crisis, pero ahora su exceso depende de la convertibilidad de deudas privadas en moneda nacional a deudas en moneda de dólares. También una cuestión explicada por el profesor. ¿Esto qué hace? Que el mercado de divisas se expanda y aparece lo que conocemos como el proceso de globalización, que va a ser seguido por un proceso de internacionalización, no solamente financiera, sino económica. Las deudas públicas en este contexto se transforman en deudas privadas y los riesgos, y los riesgos asociados a devaluaciones de la moneda y la volatilidad de la tasa de interés tienen que ser asumidos por cuentas privadas. Otro elemento de este nuevo periodo es que las cuentas financieras de la balanza de pagos son liberalizadas y la inversión extranjera en su forma directa o en portafolio se convierten en la principal fuente de liquidez internacional. A raíz que pasan todos los riesgos al sector privado, como se señaló aquí con la devaluación y el alza de la tasa de interés, se empieza a crear mecanismos para prevenir riesgos. Ya esto empieza a suceder en los 60s. Y los mercados financieros en esta historia de cubrir los riesgos de cambios en el tipo de cambio o en la tasa de interés, empiezan a generar una serie de instrumentos que se hacen cada día más complejos, crecen fundamental y lo que hace crecer la liquidez muy por encima de la producción. ¿Sí? No toda la liquidez que funciona en el mercado internacional es un problema de especulación. Parte está relacionada con esta complejización financiera que está unada a estos riesgos y obviamente también es aprovechada para especular, es decir, obtener ganancias financieras. Las corporaciones financieras en este contexto incrementan su nivel de deuda para reducir riesgos y accede a liquidez internacional y ganancias financieras. Esta es un poco la historia de la sobrecapitalización. Las deudas incrementan con respecto al PIB, el mercado de capitales se expande y se profundiza, y la innovación financiera se vuelve un elemento central del sistema financiero. El negocio bancario cambia en esta historia. Se canalizan créditos ahora a las familias, no a las empresas. O la banca compra instrumentos financieros. Ya vimos que les gustaba comprar bonos a 10 años. Y los inversionistas institucionales toman el liderazgo del sistema financiero. En el plano internacional, la producción y las finanzas se globalizan guiadas por la inflación financiera que sabemos que inevitablemente sigue a crisis financiera. Por ejemplo, tenemos el boom de las nuevas tecnologías a fines de los 90, que sube tremendamente el precio de ese sector y al cabo de un par de años se presenta la crisis del .com. Lo que más conocemos es el boom inmobiliario de principios del 2000, bueno, en los primeros 5 o 6 años del 2000, que termina en la famosa crisis financiera global de 2008. También tenemos últimamente el auge de los famosos ETF o fondos de inversión y ya empezamos a ver una crisis por el incremento de las tasas de interés. Entonces vemos que la inflación financiera siempre es interrumpida por una crisis. Eso es una particularidad de este proceso. Y aquí podemos además señalar que el sistema post-Bretton Woods, con este gran exceso de liquidez, ha proporcionado grandes volúmenes de financiamiento a la gran empresa, a la empresa pública en el sentido que cotiza en el mercado de valores, pero ha dejado a la pequeña y mediana industria con reducido crecimiento. Y esto es muy, muy importante, un efecto muy nocivo en los países en desarrollo como el nuestro. Entonces, este es más o menos lo que acabo de decir del contexto del sistema financiero internacional. ¿Qué pasa con la deuda en América Latina? Las deudas privadas sustituyen a las deudas públicas como resultado de la globalización financiera, cuando terminan los créditos entre gobiernos y que son sustituidos por la inversión extranjera, y obviamente se dispara la liquidez basada en unidad de cuentas internacionales. Es impresionante el monto de liquidez en moneda internacionales que estaban teniendo las economías en desarrollo emergente, las que abrieron sus cuentas financieras desde los 90 y particularmente desde los 2000. La inversión extranjera, como dije, sustituyó a las deudas bancarias. Vamos a tener que el exceso de inversión extranjera proporciona liquidez al crecimiento económico, pero a costa de altos niveles de estabilidad, no solo por el movimiento de la inversión extranjera de cartera, que es de corto plazo, sino además por la inversión extranjera directa, que tiene importantes elementos de corto plazo. En esta nueva etapa, la gran discusión gira en torno al tipo de cambio. Los libros de texto nos dicen que los países en desarrollo tendrían que tener tipos de cambio subvaluados para poder desarrollar su industria. Esto es bajo el supuesto que a medida que suben el precio de las importaciones, se sustituyen por bienes domésticos y de esa manera equilibro la cuenta corriente y genero crecimiento. Es un supuesto falso en las estructuras industriales de nuestros países que son débiles y tienen grandes déficits estructurales en la cuenta corriente. Este es un planteamiento que ya lo señaló Previch, que no es tan fácil armar una producción doméstica que necesita del liderazgo del Estado, que no es suficiente las devaluaciones para poder industrializarse. Entonces, lo que se opta en América Latina, y lo hemos visto en los últimos años, lo estamos viendo hoy día, particularmente en México, son los tipos de cambio sobrevaluados. ¿Cuál es la ganancia de tener un tipo de cambio sobrevaluado? Reducir el pago de los intereses y contener la inflación. Algo tiene. Con ese algo no nos podemos tampoco quedar, porque esto a la larga truena, entonces necesitas una industrialización y hay que empezar a generar proyectos de industria en nuestros países. Este sistema financiero dominante da acceso a liquidez. Este sistema va a operar bien con exceso de liquidez internacional si hay una baja inflación en la producción y una alta inflación en el sistema financiero, y requiere de tasas de interés relativamente estables y bajas. Esto último es lo que no está pasando últimamente por todos los problemas por los problemas propios de la estructura financiera, por los problemas de la pandemia y por los problemas geopolíticos en esta pelea entre Estados Unidos y China, ya que tratan de contender dónde está la gran empresa y de dónde viene el financiamiento. Entonces, esa es la situación que hoy día provoca tanta inestabilidad. Veamos muy rápidamente, para no extender tanto esta reunión y dejar tiempo a las preguntas, ¿cómo estuvo en América Latina la inflación entre influjo financiero y la cuenta corriente? Vemos que a partir de los 90, el monto de influjos financieros es muy superior a las necesidades de la cuenta corriente, ¿ya? Y nos damos cuenta que esto pasa en absolutamente todos los países. Si vemos México, en los 90 es menos 1,4, y que va a ir subiendo por la entrada del capital internacional hacia nuestro país. También eso pasa, no me voy a referir a Argentina porque tiene otros problemas, Ya en Brasil, aunque entra menos dinero, entra menos flujos después del quantitative easing, especialmente después de 2015, pero es importante en México esta historia. Vemos los saldos de la deuda externa como proporción al PIB. ¿Y qué encontramos? Que la deuda externa sube hasta más o menos los 2000. En Brasil vemos que es alta, en Argentina, en Brasil, en Colombia también pasa lo mismo, en México, aunque aquí tenemos una pequeña caída que está explicada por alguna crisis, miren el Perú y Chile, que es importante, ha ido subiendo. Chile empieza a subir antes, bueno, Chile aquí no tenemos todavía globalización. Después de 2005, si se fijan, la deuda externa como que se retrae no voy a tomar, como dije, Argentina, porque ahí cambia mucho. Definitivamente va a ser el caso de Brasil antes de COVID. No es el caso de Colombia, México y Chile, por la entrada de capital extranjero que sigue fluyendo a estas economías. Miremos la deuda a corto plazo, como porcentaje de la deuda externa total, y efectivamente, como lo señaló el profesor Toporowski, tenemos que esta ha caído particularmente ha caído en Brasil, ha caído en Perú, es menor lo que cae en México y Colombia por la situación de la entrada de capital extranjero. Y bueno, abajo tenemos la relación de la reserva como porcentaje de la deuda externa total, que ha venido, creo que sí se puede, no sé si se puede ver hasta abajo, ha venido incrementando en este periodo. Ahora quiero mirar la emisión de títulos de deuda y el monto de circulación en los mercados financieros internacionales y domésticos. También lo estoy viendo a nivel de países. Argentina se me complica por todos los movimientos políticos que están señalados en el capítulo, pero si miro a Brasil, empiezo a fijarme que sí subió el monto de emisión de bonos de las corporaciones no financieras a lo largo del periodo. Y las corporaciones financieras también van en expansión y el gobierno emite menos deuda en el mercado internacional. Aquí tenemos los mercados internos, las corporaciones financieras más o menos igual. Baja el financiamiento de las corporaciones no financieras en el mercado nacional, fíjense, y sube las del gobierno general. Veamos, yo tenía, espérenme, aquí yo tengo a Colombia y México. Si ustedes se fijan, en Colombia pasa lo mismo, una expansión importante de las corporaciones no financieras. Sube también las corporaciones financieras y también tenemos que en el mercado financiero los gobiernos se financian menos. En México, las corporaciones no financieras se volvieron locas emitiendo o comprando de fuera, el gobierno general baja y las corporaciones no financieras también duplican, y esto por la gran presencia de bancos internacionales en México. Este es, según yo, Perú, sí, aquí está. Perú, miren las corporaciones no financieras de 3 pasan a 20, es impresionante. Este es en el mercado internacional. Las corporaciones financieras también incrementan y el gobierno general baja casi en 30 puntos. Aquí tenemos el reverso en el mercado financiero. Entonces estamos teniendo una situación donde los gobiernos pueden financiarse internamente vía la emisión de títulos, es decir, si hay capacidad de nuestros mercados para hacerlo, y las corporaciones no financieras prefieren hacerlo en el mercado internacional porque es más barato. ¿ya? Ahí también va a ser un problema de, perdón, ahí va a ser un problema, bueno, ¿cómo termino esta historia? Tenemos que de los cambios que se dieron en el sistema financiero internacional, la internacionalización y la globalización, el financiamiento se globaliza particularmente por las corporaciones financieras y nos estamos viendo que el endeudamiento de la región está liderado en el exterior fundamentalmente por las corporaciones públicas, son privadas, pero las que cotizan en bolsa, y esas las que van a generar la gran inestabilidad ante los cambios de la tasa de interés y en parte van a explicar por qué los gobiernos están tan cuidadosos en no cambiar el tipo de cambio y mantenerlo sobrevaluado. Entonces, ¿qué sigue con esto? Obviamente lo que sigue es generar políticas domésticas de desarrollo económico que den las bases para la producción doméstica e ir generando políticas que alienten a la gran empresa financiarse en el mercado nacional. Termino diciendo, hay que revisar la experiencia del sudeste asiático. Ellos logran, bajo distintas formas, profundizar sus mercados financieros domésticos a fin que la gran empresa pueda obtener ahí liquidez. Gracias por la atención. Espero que les gusten estos temas para seguir discutiendo.
Gracias, doctora, por su presentación. Ahora, now we have time for a couple of questions. The people in the Zoom, you can leave it here in the chat, and I will pass it to Professor Toporowski or Dr. Noemí Levy. En el presencial, por favor, si ustedes tienen alguna pregunta, la pueden hacer directo. Entonces esperamos las preguntas. Ahorita no tenemos ninguna en el chat.
Tenemos una y te la vamos a traducir, ¿vale?
Ok.
Primero, una preocupación por la actualización del análisis. Según vi y no se alcanzaba a ver el último año, estamos hablando de estadísticas hasta 2017. Hoy estamos en 2023, o sea, ya pasaron 6 años. Esa es una preocupación acerca de lo que, el nuevo análisis que tenemos que hacer. La segunda es que no podemos hablar ya de una guerra entre Estados Unidos sin una fracturación del mundo en dos bloques. El G2 con Rusia y China y Estados Unidos con sus satélites de la OTAN, donde también podemos advertir que el dólar está perdiendo hegemonía a nivel mundial, sobre todo con posibles divisas que surjan de los países del BRICS. Como dijo la expositora, el presidente de Brasil fue a China, fue a visitar a China y ahí saludó a Dilma, que es la nueva presidenta de uno de los del Banco de los BRICS, que está casi a la par en cuanto a capital del Banco Mundial. Eso es en cuanto a nivel internacional. Me preocupa mucho que no estemos actualizados en los últimos acontecimientos. En cuanto a México, hay cosas diferentes, sobre todo en dos aspectos que mencionaron. Uno es que a partir de 2018, México implementó una política económica de no deuda externa, de no mayor deuda externa, y eso se ha respetado hasta el momento. Lo que ha crecido es el costo de la deuda por el incremento en las tasas de interés. Y segundo, ya no podemos hablar de una subvaluación o sobrevaluación del peso. Tenemos que hablar de una depreciación o apreciación del peso. Y actualmente el peso mexicano está más o menos en 18 pesos por dólar, cuando el año pasado andábamos en 21 pesos por dólar. Entonces tenemos que hacer también un nuevo análisis sobre la situación financiera de México, ¿sí? De lo que sucedió hace 6 años. Muchas gracias.
Thanks. First, I would like to express a concern regarding the statistics I saw in the presentation, because these are from 2017 and we are in 2023. So I think we should update the data presentation. In addition to this, I believe we should speak about the two blocks, one involved with G2 Russia and the other one with the United States. Speak about the currencies derived from words.
No se entiende nada.
And regarding Mexico, from 2018, Mexico's foreign policy has been one to avoid foreign debt. And so we would like to point out that for the question whether we can truly speak about an overvaluation of this.
Hemos terminado.
Okay. Let me read two questions for you both. The first question is for Axel Santillan. The dependency of international banks and their currencies is irreversible, since the national banks of emerging countries have been dismantled. In this context, how to promote national banking and savings in emerging countries, to promote development, and how to convince the private sector to access national credit, to give access, I think. The second question is from Adalberto. How can emerging economies develop domestic financial markets under the post-quantitative easing context, with highly interdependency for funding between governments, corporations, and international banks? We have these two questions. If wherever you, I don't know, Professor Toporowski, you want to react to these questions? Your mic. Yes.
I know, Noemí, do you want to answer this first, or shall I make a couple of comments?
Doctora, su micrófono.
Up to you, Jan, as you wish.
Okay, maybe I'll answer first. This is a critical question, because it touches upon the whole issue of dollarization, which is so prevalent in Latin America. There are obvious ways in which, the obvious way in which the government can encourage the use of domestic currency and domestic credit is it's usually by laws specifying what is the legal means, what's called in English legal tender, the legal means of settling contracts, because the very common legal requirement is that debts have to be settled in the currency of the country or the currency of the jurisdiction. But this, of course, is difficult to enforce and often doesn't work quite as well. The alternate, the other way of doing it, which I think is a much more positive and much more general, is really a policy of maintaining the stability of the financial markets. And this, I think, has to be done by the central bank. I think the central bank has to make the stability of the markets much more of a priority, and this includes active intervention in the markets, with the exception, obviously, of the foreign exchange markets, where it's this is much more problematical. The intervention I have in mind is regulating the liquidity of those markets. Typically, dollarization arises if there is too much liquidity in the financial markets, and therefore it becomes very easy to convert let's say bank deposits into foreign currency. The way you prevent this is by active issuing, for example, of longer term securities, which will absorb this liquidity. In English central banking, it's referred to sterilization, and I think that needs to be done, but it needs to be done with a view to financial stability and not with a view to regulating, let's say, the money supply, which is the way in which it's usually considered by central banks. And then the other thing that the other factor, the way in which the financial system could be stabilized, is for active maintenance of a stable yield curve for government securities. The more there is a stable yield curve, the yield curve being which shows the rate of interest at different maturities of government bonds. The more stable is that yield curve, the more it encourages financing at different maturities. That, I think, is those are the essential instruments. But having said that, it's not a free market economy by definition is going to be unstable. So for that, in order to avoid the worst crises, it needs a certain amount of flexibility on the part of the central bank and the financial authorities, rather than what I see happening now is the dedication towards the dogmatic fixation on inflation targeting or alternative exchange rate, fixed exchange rates.
Thank you, Professor Toporowski. Professor Noemí.
Well, I will turn now in English for everyone to join the discussion. in terms of the first intervention, I didn't got the question. I think I agree that today the world is debating between multi-forces and geopolitical problems. On one side, we have the famous G2, which is based on the, ¿cómo se llama? Which is based on the BRICS, led by China, and we have the European Union connected with the US, with all the geopolitical friction that arise from the issue of the war, the European war, I will call it that way. So there is a lot of problems and tensions, and the US wanting to bring, with all the nearshoring policy, bringing from China to its political, geographical domination, all the big industry. And this is creating a lot of tension. This is creating inflation, and it's not the issue of interest rate. So I would agree with the person that spoke that these are the problems, and perhaps we are transiting from a hyper globalization to regional globalization. Perhaps we are in this context today. I have my doubts that the dollar will be weakened so much as it will disappear. I think it will have to survive with other currency. This will be the ultimate arrangement that was something along in the in the 1970s between the fight with the Japanese yen, the German mark, and the dollar. There was a sort of fight that the US won with Volcker's monetary policy. I don't know how it will stabilize, but it looks it's going that way. In terms of what was said by Mexico, you're right. With the new government, they don't want external debt, and they're trying to diminish it as long as possible. We need to acknowledge that even before public debt was based on domestic system, rather it was switched from the international sphere to the domestic sphere. This is very interesting in terms that it can be shown that finance can come from domestic market. So this is a way that we have to analyze how to bring it for the private sector. And in this sense, Jansen said something very interesting. You have to stabilize liquidity. Yeah, you cannot have all these movements, because obviously what will do corporation is go outside. So what to do inside in order to develop this market? I will start for the more basic thing. You have to increase productive spending and see the means through taxation, through other incentives that finance will come from the domestic market. In terms of what you were saying, Jan, obviously all debts have to be settled in the domestic currency. There is no question about it. The problem is with multinationals that there is a lot of contract inside the big corporation that don't pass through national contracts. Yeah, that they're settled between them on the side of the domestic, on the side of what's going on in the country. There are big corporations settling among themselves, even trying to manage the debt of one country that is in the corporation to another. So it's a task difficult to manage, but I think that through taxation incentives and stabilization of the financial market, something can be done. If we see what happens in South Korea and usually in the winning countries of Asia, yeah, they have been able to develop their financial market so that it can provide domestic liquidity to private non-financial corporation. I think we have to learn from that, because if not, things will be extremely unstable. And I don't see any, well, if we have international banks, the case of Mexico, that actually 60% of assets, or a bit more, are under a multinational bank, the issue is how to regulate them. Because although I think it's important, like in the case of Banamex today, that it will stay in Mexican hands, it's easier to regulate. And I will finish with a problem that our countries have in terms of monetary policy. On one side, we have to guarantee enough international currency to stabilize the exchange rate, to reduce interest, to reduce prices. But on the other side, we have to follow, literally follow what the Fed does. In terms of Mexico, well, the problem with the border, 3,000 kilometers and whatsoever, but it also happens in the south of the continent. So there needs to, and the only way I see to break this relation is through a program of industrialization in which productive activity will be financed by domestic markets. And this needs to be heard by the government, by the state. And you have to be much more careful today of what you mean by industrialization program. If you want to start with these huge programs, as in the 50s and in the 60s, you will need too much, and you will rely too much in international finance. You need to approach it in a different way, I would argue. So medium, big domestic projects, not multinationals, in order that you will create domestic productive and financing. I think this is the thing that we have to fight today. We cannot continue to grow independently of the internal market. This has been the case of Latin America in the last 40 years. Everything, well, 30, everything for exports. For export, we don't care if workers are paid good or bad. No industrial policy. Yeah, everything is over. I think this needs to be changed today in an urgent manner for our countries. I will finish with that, and I would like to thank Jorge and everyone for this nice conversation.
Thank you, both of you. Sorry, but the people of the staff told me that we don't have more time for question or discussion. And I only have to say, again, thank you, both of you, for this marvelous discussion, this marvelous two presentations. Quiero agradecer a la gente de Acatlán, especialmente al profesor Jorge Villegas y a la profesora Mónica Patricia Hernández Moncayo, que nos permitieron, bueno, ellos organizaron el evento. I want to thank the people that is still in the Zoom room. Thank you everybody for being here. It was a marvelous discussion. I don't know, no sé si quieren decir alguna palabra. Bueno,
Jan, are you
palabra.
eager to say a few final words?
Yeah, yes, I would just say that I'm very delighted that this whole that this discussion has happened. I'm very relieved that it was not created by artificial intelligence, but we have real people, even though you're on a screen. And I thank I thank you for, well, I would like to thank the audience for listening, and the people who've asked the questions, including the last one, for some very interesting and very important questions, because these are ones that could be discussed much longer. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you. I hope the next time we
Yeah.
can see you in person and have you
Yeah.
with more time to chat.
Yeah. And also thanks to you and the staff at Acatlán for your kind invitation to me. Thank you.
Okay, profesor, Jorge Villegas, por favor.
Gracias, doctor. Le agradecemos al doctor Toporowski, a la doctora Noemí Levy y sobre todo a ti, maestro, por habernos hecho el favor de comunicarnos, de contactarnos con el doctor para celebrar esta muy esperada evento. Agradecemos, vamos a enviarle, hacerle llegar al profesor Toporowski la constancia del evento el día de hoy. Igual le haremos llegar a la maestra Levy igual su reconocimiento, que es lo único con que puede pagar la universidad. La verdad es un placer haber estado escuchando a grandes eminencias y que tienen un reconocimiento internacional muy importante y que para nosotros es muy grato poderlos estar directamente con la gente que hace el conocimiento de la ciencia económica. Les agradecemos muchísimo, les enviamos un cordial y fraternal saludo y esperamos verlos por acá en algún momento en Acatlán, que es su casa. Agradecemos también a la licenciada Lorna Sánchez, su colaboración, por supuesto, a la maestra Kenia Ayala, forman parte del equipo de economía que hemos dado paso durante estos días a la Semana de Economía. Agradecemos también a nuestros profesores que nos han acompañado y sobre todo a los alumnos que han estado aquí con la gran paciencia y ansiosos del conocimiento. Doctor, envíales un cordial abrazo, doctora Noemí Levy. Les agradecemos su atención y sobre todo al doctor Toporowski. Thank you, Mr. Toporowski, for today.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Esperemos que este tipo de reuniones nos permitan empezar a hacer nuevos proyectos y nuevas discusiones sobre el devenir de nuestra historia en este continente.
Muchas gracias a todos. Thank you, everyone. Professor Toporowski. My pleasure again.
Nos vemos.
Gracias a
Sí.
todos.
You,
Yes.
Jen.
Thank you. Thank
Nos
you,
vemos.
everyone.
Chao, chao.
Chao,
Chao.
chao.